Part 3. The Characters. The characters in this movie have absolutely nothing to do or are written so incomprehensibly that you want to die. I'll start with the supporting characters and work my way up to the main character and villain of this film, primarily because I want to burn through 11 characters as quickly as possible without expending much time. Alright, go. Hina, useless. Chiyoko, useless. Satonaka, useless. Goto, useless. Date, useless. Kogami, just vomits out exposition, but otherwise useless. Ancient O's, seems like he might be a legit threat initially, but is ultimately useless. Kazuri, useless. Mazul, useless. Gamel, useless. Uva, actually no. Uva has a pretty cool fight with Goda, so I'm actually gonna give him the pass because he does something that was memorable. Aside from that, a lot of the problems with an excess of characters boil down to this movie only being an hour long, because there's simply just not enough time to give them anything of relevance to do. Now the only characters we're left with are Ankh, Eiji, and Goda. Ankh is perhaps the most coherently written important character in the movie, but even then he has his problems. Ankh's role in the story has been flipped from the television series, where there he was one of the more knowledgeable characters, but here is a fish out of water in a world he doesn't understand. This sort of role reversal is something that this film is particularly fond of, as illustrated by the ending, which directly parallels the finale of the show. So, all that in mind, we would expect to the cause of stopping Ancient O's and the greed, which appears to be true, but just a scene later he proclaims that he doesn't care what happens to humanity. However, a couple scenes later he reminisces with Hina on the pier about the good old days, so clearly he does have some attachment to these people, even if he can't necessarily express it because greed are incapable of deeper emotions such as love, which is also later contradicted by him swelling up and crying while talking to Eiji inside Eiji's dying brain. Ankh at least has some semblance of a character arc, with him warming up to humans and having to accept Eiji's death, but this really just ends up being a jumbled mess of a speed run through the character arc he underwent in the show already. I don't even think the arc is really that hard to fix. You just need to make him more indifferent towards humans, but then be persuaded into action against Ancient O's by some mechanism. I mean, I would still say it's a touch treading water from the show, but at least it would feel like an improvement over what you have. May I remind you, this is the most coherently written and developed character in the film. Oh my god. Then there's Eiji, perhaps the most bizarre writing choice in this film, and that's saying something, is that Eiji is dead throughout the entirety of the film, and is merely a corpse being puppeted around by either Ankh or Goda throughout. I don't have a problem with him not being the protagonist of this film, because Ankh clearly occupies that role, but it's just that he's dead and serves very little function to the story. We do get a brief scene inside his dying brain where he's smiling like a jackass in front of his sobbing friend, but other than that, it's like nothing. I really just don't know what to make of this, because there's no emotion evoked other than emptiness. I can't fathom what prompted this creative decision. Now, I don't think death in Kamen Rider is inherently a bad thing. Hell, there's a good version of this film where Eiji dies at the end, but this is just such a bizarre choice to make the protagonist, and at that, one of the more beloved Kamen Rider protagonists in Japan, just be a non-actor in the film named after his own series. Then there's the movie's big bad, Goda, who is like all things original to this film, completely baffling. First, his backstory isn't the worst thing ever. The Kogami Foundation tried to create a new set of core metals fueled by the desire of Eiji Hino, and thus Goto was born. Sure, I can buy it, they've attempted it in the past. Then he inhabits Eiji's body once he's killed by Ancient O's, and this is where I start to take some issue with things. I'm not exactly sure how Goto's core metals found their way to Eiji's body. He was just killed in the middle of some random field. So perhaps it's just a coincidence they arrived there to inhabit Eiji's body sometime within the first 24 to 72 hours of him being dead, because it would seem his body hasn't really undergone any of the stages of decomposition yet. Maybe Goto was lucky. Whatever, it's just a nitpick. What really irks me about the character is what seems to motivate the character. He states that he wants to achieve Eiji's goals of saving people, which it's kind of implied to the audience that we're not supposed to take this claim on face value because of the later scene of Ankh and Hina on the pier discussing that they're just manipulating and using Goto. And then immediately after, there's a scene of Date and Goto confronting him with their distrust of him. These scenes aren't out of character and make enough sense, especially if it was revealed Goto was lying. The thing is that the film ultimately implies he wasn't lying after Ankh and Goto defeat Ancient O's, and he does a complete heel turn after being tempted by the power of the core metals. This shot of Goto looking wide-eyed at the floating mass of cell and core metals would seem to imply that something primal has been awakened within him, or as if he was possessed or tempted by the core metals themselves. All of a sudden, he's evil because he was tempted by power for like 5 seconds. Real satisfying main villain, yeah? This also isn't helped by him suddenly taking up the mantle of Big Bad after Ancient O's held that title for about 72% of the film's runtime. I guess the benefit of Goto as the main villain over Ancient O's is that he at least has some semblance of a personality, just not one that makes much sense. And that's the film's characters in a nutshell. Now, most of the cast not doing much isn't a huge deal, because like I said earlier, I get it, the film is only an hour long, you only have so much time, and you want to dedicate it to the truly important characters. But it raises the question, why just jam so many of them in there anyways? I mean, I get it, nostalgia. But from a storytelling perspective, the bare essentials are the minority in this film. I wouldn't really even have an issue with this if they weren't all just introduced right up front in the first scene as if to imply a greater degree of significance to their part in the film beyond just, I recognize, I know them. Worse than that, the characters who do get developed feel incoherent and unpredictable in ways that don't complement the story. Part 4. The Freezer. The middle of this film is mostly not even worth talking about on its own for 2 reasons. 1, because it's basically just a bunch of exposition, and 2, I've pretty much covered all the relevant parts of said exposition in other parts of this video. However, there's this one tiny little moment that I didn't even really think about on my first watch of this film. It is single-handedly a macrocosm for the entirety of the film's problems, and it only lasts for a brief few seconds. Basically, when Ankh and Hina go to visit who they think to be Eiji tucked away from the world, Goto greets them, pretending to be Eiji, and to sway Ankh to his side of the cause, he reaches into his freezer and pulls him out a popsicle. Now, I just don't understand what's happening here. First, we must assume something is powering this freezer so that the popsicles contained inside don't melt away to slush. So, what the hell is powering this freezer? I have no idea. Since the world is in a state of post-apocalypse, and evidently not many humans are still alive, I just have to wonder who is maintaining the power grid. With how fucked over the world seems to be, you would think that people would be more focused on, I don't know, surviving. Now, let's just consider something else. Where did Gota get the popsicles from? Did he just happen to find them in the supermarket? Did the supermarket also have power for some reason? Or did he just pre-prepare these popsicles here like he's fucking Lelouch on the off chance that Ankh might be resurrected even though he wasn't previously for no reason? At this point, just to explain this small second of the film, I am doing Olympic-level mental gymnastics. Is this all incredibly pedantic? Yes, absolutely. But it honestly wouldn't even really bother me if the tone of this film was different. In fact, that's a thesis statement that can be made for a lot of my criticism over the past nth minutes of this review. If this film had just been more comedically toned and leaned into the inherent silliness and fun spectacle of guys in colorful suits beating the shit out of each other, I might have enjoyed this a hell of a lot more, because I can excuse small bits of absurdity like that if the tone is just a little more humorous and upbeat. Now, if only there was a piece of media that functioned similar to that. Oh wait, it's called Kamen Rider O's, a series that had its fair share of emotional gut punches, but also features an episode where Goto takes an insult that he has a thick head so literally, he turns his head into a rock and clobbers an enemy with it. This movie is just completely monotone and one note, as a result making it boring. This is the core problem with this movie. It misses the point of Kamen Rider O's, and even if it didn't live up to the tone of the original show, that's not inherently bad. It just also happens to not be good at conveying its own tone in a consistent and coherent way. I could end the review right here, because the core flaw of this film has been readily exposed. But for the sake of my own personal closure, I will be dissecting